Chapter 20. Pharaoh, King of Egypt. High on its lofty plateau, surrounded by its limestone cliffs, guarded by its mountains, stood the little dark city of Jerusalem. Not very big, no river to guard it, no great fortifications, but Taharka's heart stirred strangely at the sight of it. As a child, he had heard stories. David, a mighty warrior king, a wise king, Solomon, who had married a princess of Egypt. And it was the city of Amos. And what was the king's name? Hezekiah, the king who had said no more to the Assyrians. And so the Assyrians now were here, massed before the gray walls of the city, as they had been massed before the walls of Lachish. Not the whole army. That had not been thought necessary. For some time now, the city had been under siege, cut off from its food supplies by the Assyrian patrols, shut in like a bird in a cage. So Sennacherib had remained in Lachish, preparing for a southward expedition to mop up what was left of the desert rebellions. The Tartan commanded the Jerusalem wing. The Rabshakeh was also present. But what puzzled Taharka most was their treatment of himself. It was, to say the least, not what he had expected of Assyrian captivity. He sat alone in his tent, his own tent, all to himself. A servant to bring him food. They had brought him a change of clothes, a fine tunic, a robe of embroidered cloth. The garments, he thought, of an Assyrian prince. He didn't understand it. What was going on? He thought of the old stories of ancient god kings, pampered, served for a year, then slain in sacrifice in honor of the gods. But they seemed to have had something else in mind. "The king has use for you in Jerusalem," the Tartan had said. What? A mouse ran over his foot. The camp was overrun with them, drawn by the grain, perhaps, the leftover food from the tents of the officers. He shook himself in disgust. Then he heard steps outside. He had a visitor. His guard held back the flap of the tent, bowing low in respect, and into the circle of light from the earthenware lamp stepped the Rabshakeh. Amazed and wary, Taharka rose to his feet. To his further astonishment, the Rabshakeh gently bowed his head in a gesture of courtesy between equals. He glanced around the tent. "They have seen to your comfort?" Taharka relaxed a little and nodded, then shook his head in wonder. "I understand why the Assyrians take few prisoners," he said. "There would be nothing left for the king." "But then," said Rabshakeh, "you are not an ordinary prisoner." Taharka stiffened, suddenly alert. But the Rabshakeh smiled reassuringly. "You are, after all, a physician. A wonderful thing to be a physician. Our lives are in your hands." "I am not a physician," said Taharka. He did not like being played with. "I am only an assistant and a student of the craft." "Yes, a student. A student of other things as well. Languages, courtly manners. Well, after all, it is your study of the physician's craft that concerns us." He seemed suddenly distracted. "There is some sickness among our men, all at once. A curious thing." "If I can help," said Taharka. A sick man was a sick man, Assyrian or not. It would give him something to occupy his time. "We have physicians of our own." The Rabshakeh had tired of the game. His eyes narrowed. "But you could be to help us in another way." "No other way," said Taharka sharply. "You forget. I traveled with the Mukri. I am your enemy." He thought of what he had seen at Lachish. If he never had another enemy in the world, the Assyrian would be his enemy. "And," said the Rabshakeh, "you have watched and seen what becomes of our enemies." He was smiling, but Taharka felt for him a horror he had never known before. "On the other hand, our friends, we have many friends. Physicians, princes." The word and the man's sharp gaze struck the boy like a blow. The Assyrian rose and moved restlessly about the tent. I put a puzzle before you. Suppose in some foreign land there was a prince of the royal blood, who wanted to be a king, a pretender. The true king, if you like, but he was driven out by another pretender, another king, forced to take refuge with the sand ramblers, the scum of the desert. And then help came to him where he least expected it. A mighty lord, a king of kings, offered him his hand in friendship, offered him his power and all his armed might to give him what he wanted. He laughed suddenly. Here's another puzzle. What if this man, this boy, were not a prince at all? What if he were some runaway thief off the docks of Napata, thrown into our hands by a stroke of luck, offered a prize beyond the dreams of such a piece of scum? Taharka jumped to his feet. He was shaking. He had never felt such anger. The Rabshakeh waved his hand gently. It's only a puzzle. He sighed and shrugged. The point is, it wouldn't matter. If the King of Kings says a thing, it is so. It was true. Such was the power of Sennacherib. Taharka's rage turned to cold despair. They don't care, he thought. They don't care who I am. King or god or beggar boy, it doesn't matter to them. The truth, the law, the gods, nothing matters to them but their greed and their power. And what, said the Rabshakeh, do you think my king would ask in return? His mouth dry, Taharka heard himself whisper, what would he ask? Suddenly, the Rabshakeh's manner changed, hard and sharp, like a traitor. This was an offer. This was business. No more resistance. Loyalty as to an overlord. Help in times of trouble, like this. And tribute. Gold. Manpower. Stones from your mines. He was smiling again. You see, so little, really. And in return, well, tomorrow you will see what we have in mind. Still smiling, the friendly visitor, but his eyes were like stone. And after all, life is the greatest return of all, whether it is the life of a man, a city, or the life of an entire land. He rose to his feet. We will talk again. After tomorrow. Tomorrow I will lay the mercy of my king before this little rebel princeling in the city. We are a merciful people, you know. You have seen our righteous anger. Tomorrow you will see how merciful we can be. Suddenly he jumped. Taharka jumped too, his nerves as tight as a bowstring. Mice! Where do they come from? He shook his robe and went out grumbling. They're worse than the Mukri. The Rabshakeh sat in his chair before the gray wall of Jerusalem. Behind him stood the tartan. Behind the tartan were ranged the elite guard of the Assyrians, tall men, straight and still, covered by their shields. And before them stood Taharka. They had brought him out, dressed in his Assyrian finery, to see and for some reason to be seen. Before them all stood the crier with his voice like a trumpet of bullhorn. Come out, Hezekiah, king of Judah. Come out and hear the words of your King of Kings. There was a creaking sound at the great main gate. Taharka leaned forward. Was he at last to see this mad rebel against a mighty empire? This courageous prince, Amos's glorious king? A man came through the gate, attended only by 2 scribes with tablets and writing sticks. No, it could not be the king. An elderly, bearded man in a peaked hat and fine linen robe, a man of rank and authority, but not the king. His eyes, tired and wary, looked full into the eyes of the Rabshakeh. He bowed, but only in courtesy, not as one offering tribute. I am Eliakim, son of Hilkiah, lord of the king's household. I will hear the words of your king." He spoke in the court language of Babylon. The Rabshakeh smiled, a little flicker of a smile, and answered him in the language of Judah. "The King of Kings is angry with your king. He sent him to come before him at Lachish for judgment, and he did not come." "Nor will he," said Eliakim, still in the language spoken by the Assyrians. The Rabshakeh was not smiling now. "Who has given him this counsel?" Eliakim was silent. "Have you given him this counsel?" The Rabshakeh had leaned forward, his eyes hard as black iron. For the first time, the Lord Eliakim quailed. The Rabshakeh was a man who could inspire fear. "No," said the Assyrian scornfully, "not you. And my king says this: in whom do you trust that you rebel against me?" He turned suddenly to the Tartan, who took hold of the Cushite boy and thrust him before the 3 men of Judah. "You trust in the staff of this bruised reed," shouted the Rabshakeh, "in Egypt, on which if a man lean, it will go into his hand and pierce it? So is Pharaoh, king of Egypt, to all that trust him. See how he stands before you." And Taharka stood before them, before the 3 men, before the people on the wall, for the wall was now crowded with people of the city. He stood there, a king, Pharaoh, king of Egypt. This was the use the Assyrians had had for him in Jerusalem. This was the return they had in mind. He had never before felt such shame. The people were very still. Pharaoh, king of Egypt, in whom they had indeed placed their trust, a prisoner in the hands of the Assyrians? "I'll speak to them," thought Taharka. "I'll cry out to them that I am not Pharaoh, king of Egypt, that that's a lie." But he did not have a chance to speak. The Rabshakeh sprang to his feet. He held out his arms to the people on the wall. His voice outrang the voice of the crier. "Hear the words of my king! Do not let Hezekiah deceive you, for he will not be able to deliver you out of my hand." His voice became the voice of a father exhorting his prodigal children to come home. "Do not listen to Hezekiah. Listen to my king. He says to you, make an agreement with me. Come to me. You are hungry. You are thirsty. Come out to me, and every man will eat of his own vine and his own fig tree, and everyone will drink the waters of his well. Have no fear of my king. He comes to take you away to a land like your own land, a land of corn and wine, a land of olive oil and honey, a land of bread and vineyards, that you may live and not die." His voice dripped scorn. "And do not listen to your king when he tells you your God will deliver you. What God among all the nations has delivered his country out of our hands, that your God should deliver Jerusalem?" The people on the wall were silent, strangely silent. What were they thinking? Thought Taharka. Far off as they were, hidden by the turrets, he could not see them clearly. But he thought they must be very thin, hollow-eyed, like the elderly lord of the household and the 2 scribes. Their food must be very low. They must be hungry. What would they do in order, as the Rabshakeh had said, to live and not die? The Rabshakeh, too, was wondering. His gaze swept the wall, searching for faces. He listened, waiting for the first cry of surrender and the first outburst of rebellion against the Judahite king. But still, there was no sound. The Assyrian returned to his chair. He beckoned the Lord Eliakim close. He leaned forward, and for a long time stared at the old man with a look of malevolence Taharka had never seen before, chilling the boy's heart like a cold mist. What was in the Assyrian's mind? If his words of mercy had not prevailed, what next? Some terrible act of warning? Taharka thought of the scenes at Lachish and shuddered. The old man stood tall. His eyes did not waver. After a while, the Rabshakeh leaned back in his chair. His eyes were like the eyes of a lion robbed of its prey, but his voice was calm, almost careless. "You have heard the words of my king. Return with them to yours." He waved him away as if dismissing a troublesome servant. The Lord Eliakim bowed, still the simple bow of courtesy, and, straight and firm as ever, returned to the gate of the city. There was a long silence. The Assyrian turned to Taharka. "You have heard, Cushite. My words were for you too, but what you have been offered today, whoever you may be, is far beyond the dreams of those people on the wall of the city, or of that old servant of the little rebel king." He nodded to Taharka's guard. "Take him back to his tent." Taharka sat alone in his tent. The night outside was dark, moonless. The voice hummed in his ears, sweet and purring, ringing and wild. "Come to me. Make an agreement with me. What would the King of Kings ask in return? So little, really." So little, really? For what? The double crown? The downfall of Shabbataka? Shepneset? And for those who said no, "Haru, Hawk, Great One." The voice, soft and hissing, came from the foot of the flap of the tent. Someone had passed Taharka's guard, snaking low on the ground through the dark of the night. Someone slithered beneath the flap, then rose to his feet, shaking dust and earth from his garments. It was Amos.